So Ostrom was, well, first of all, maybe some introduction. She is, I think, is Norwegian, and is actually the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. I always say Nobel Prize with quotation marks since it's not a official Nobel Prize. It's actually given by the Swedish Central Bank, and Alfred Nobel was actually Norwegian, and so the Nobel Committee is not at all involved with the economics Nobel, interestingly. She won this award in, I think, 1990, when was this, 1994, so actually might have been later, but for work that she did in the 1990s. This book came out in 1990 or 1991. It's called Governing the Commons. And it's really interesting because it does away with many of the prior understandings of how institutions work, and really caused a lot of people to rethink some of their ideas. So why and how, and what are the methods that she used, and how did she get people to rethink their ideas? 1 second, I'm switching my tea here. Okay, so basically she starts with the premise of new institutional economics, and in many ways she points to the limitations of this subdiscipline. So many of you may have heard of new institutional economics. It's called new institutional to oppose it from the old institutional economics, which is maybe sounds obvious, but what does that mean? The old institutionalists actually are very strongly associated with the German historical school, die historische Schule. So people like Gustav Schmoller, even Max Weber and others were part of this sort of attempt to ground economic, political, other types of theory in a historical framework that looks at the purpose of institutions, particularly, which is, of course, where it gets the name. The new institutional economics is actually an attempt to blend the study of institutions with neoclassical economics. So I say here, new institutional economics begins with many of the same assumptions of the standard neoclassical theory, and things like methodological individualism, that you start, and actually analyze individual behavior. You're not really looking at how groups behave and how the behavior of groups is distinct from the behavior of individuals. So in my opinion, it makes many of the same fallacies as the neoclassical model. And so just my warning as you advance in your studies, to be a little bit wary of this new institutional economics, which for me is not very promising. Of course, everyone has their own opinions. So they add to this, of course, things like transaction costs and frictions like monitoring costs and incomplete information. So in that sense, it is an improvement. It's not, it is not to say that new institutional economics is entirely useless, or that it is just as bad or worse than neoclassical economics. It is an improvement, again, over the standard model. In my opinion, it is not enough of an improvement. And as we'll see with Elinor Ostrom's work, she shows exactly how where the limits are. So she starts her book with this notion of the tragedy of the commons, which some of you probably have heard of. And it's got its start in an essay, 1968, by Garrett Hardin in the magazine Science, and where he was actually discussing common grazing fields for herders, who have sheep. And one of the conclusions or the observations that Hardin made is that each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit. So basically, this idea then became generalized as a prisoner's dilemma, this notion that basically, if you have a common resource that does not have a distinct property association to some individual, it is difficult to exclude people, that the essential tendency is towards overuse, overexploitation, and to drainage of whether this is a fishery or a common field or forest or whatever the resource is. So again, it was generalized as a prisoner's dilemma, which of course, we will get into in the I think it's the next, or maybe it's the lecture after the next one. And basically the idea is that these paradoxes, so the paradox in behavior, suggest that it is impossible for rational creatures to cooperate. So the paradox that we are at the same time rational, and at the same time that the outcomes of individual behavior lead to a very poor, or to a poor outcome. Individual behavior leads to a poor outcome, is an argument, according to Campbell, that basically we're not able to cooperate. Also, there's Olson. He's I think he was he a political scientist? Could have been an economist. Working on a group behavior and group theory. And Ostrom uses Olson to begin with, in many senses, as a starting point. And his conclusions were that only small n groups are able to sustain cooperation. So as groups grow, you're no longer able to ensure that the behavior that is required to sustain the resource is able to be achieved. So Ostrom tends to disagree, and based on many observations that she made over decades, and studying also the writings and studies of others, of anthropologists, and doing field work, actually in Germany, in the University of Bielefeld, she found that many of these theoretical observations are quite flawed, to put it mildly. And she writes at the beginning of her book that those attempting to use these models, the ones that were just discussed, the prisoner's dilemma and the notion of the tragedy of the commons, and similar such models like Olson's, as the basis for policy prescription, frequently have achieved little more than a metaphorical use of the models. And then she discusses also the limitations of metaphorical models. So to what extent does the model that we're using actually represent the world, and to what extent are biases that are inherent and certain judgments already go into these models? So the use of these models then leads to deterministic conclusions, she suggests, and she cites an article in The Economist, which basically puts it in a very descriptive way, that it's like helpless individuals caught in an inexorable process of destroying their own resources. So it sounds very dramatic. And basically she says that looking at the world and looking at these resources in this way leads to two main prescriptions. One, or firstly, the state should intervene. And she calls this the Leviathan as the only way option. And secondly, that privatization is the only way. And so in each of these cases, she's saying that the policymakers and academics are emphasizing the role only of external actors, whether the state or some market mechanism or private owner, people basically coming in from the outside and saying, well, this is, I will save the resource, give me the power, give me the access, and we'll solve the problem. So she says that actually, looking at reality and looking at these common resources all over the world, there's not enough focus by academics on things like self-governance and self-organization. So then she develops this concept of the common pool resource as a self-organized entity, or as a self-organized set of resources, or institutions rather, that require certain commitments, shared norms, adequately low discount rates, monitoring, and a few other criteria. So, given these criteria, it should be possible for individuals, citizens, farmers, fishers, whatever else, or whoever else, to actually organize among themselves access and utilization or extraction or whatever of the particular resource. Of course, she says there are problems, although her constant emphasis is always to say that that scientists generally are too focused on the problems and not on the actual practices that people actually engage in every day in order to very successfully overcome these challenges. But in any case, she does say there are the problems of supplying a new institution So, when there is a change, say when there is a depletion or when there are new members or new citizens coming in and the resource is suddenly shared amongst a larger or a smaller amount of persons. So the problem, of course, of supplying an adequate institution or creating an adequate institution is one, the ability to make credible commitments. So, how does one believe that people say, well, I will only take my share, which of course is attached to the problem of mutual monitoring. So how do you ensure that everyone is transparently, basically keeping an eye on their fellow members and maintaining the resource in the desirable way? And she basically calls these problems second order collective dilemmas, because it's a problem of actually creating the institutions that then manage the resource. So at a higher level, somebody has to get together and then create these rules. And then also those rules will change and have to change over time as the nature of the resource changes. And, for instance, we have things like climate change happening now. And so again, it's a second order collective dilemma, but it's not one that is unsolvable, she says. And so she has this catalog of criteria or principles, as she says, design principles, based on the observations of successful CPRs, common pool resources, that generally seem to be necessary, if not sufficient, for the long-term existence of these CPRs. And I'll just go through these, and then we will move on to something I think that will be more interesting for all of you. And that is, so you need clearly defined boundaries. So she says individuals or households who have rights to withdraw the resource units from the CPR must be clearly defined, as must be the boundaries of the CPR itself. So the question of, what is actually the resource? Is it the field? Is it the field and the forest? Is it the inlet where the fishery is? Is it also the area outside? What are the boundaries? It's very important, she says, that there be clear boundaries. So congruence between appropriation and provision rules and local conditions. Okay, what does that mean? Appropriation rules restricting time, place, technology, and or quantity of resource units are related to local conditions and to provision rules requiring labor, material, and or money. So she's basically saying that these rules actually have to be implemented in a way that fits the local conditions and not, say, those that some central bureaucracy somewhere stipulates and says, well, it should be this way or it should be that way. So this is, in a sense, the notion of tacit knowledge. People who are located there where the resource is being used usually have more information about, what are improvements and what the capacities also are that this resource pool is able to manage. As you see there, you can see this in the sense of having the difference between stocks and flows. You have a stock of, say, 10,000 fish, and let's not talk about viewing nature as a commodity, but just speaking here, what is she trying to say? And if too many fish are being fished out of this fishery, then of course you will have an incongruence between the appropriation and provisions, because the fish are not replenishing quickly enough, and the resource will be gone over the long term. Thirdly is a collective choice arrangement. So, these rules, most individuals affected by the operational rules can participate in modifying the operational rules. So in a sense, those people who are affected by the decisions also have the ability to, voice their concerns, and then in the end change the rules as need be. So they don't need to go 200 kilometers to some central bureaucracy and then apply to actually have some change in rules, but they can collectively meet at a meeting somewhere once a month or twice a year and actually voice their grievances and say, well, actually the neighbor has been using too many, he's been having his herd on the field too long, and, and so on. So it's basically a sort of a democratic mandate, or the ability to directly redress any issues, problems, conflicts. Fourthly is monitoring. Monitors who actively audit CPR conditions and appropriation behavior or appropriator behavior are accountable to the appropriators or are the appropriators. So basically, again, this notion she's trying to dispel and move away from, we need state actors, we need some kind of a private corporation that is responsible for, the ownership of the assets. And she's saying actually people can monitor themselves. And again, they have to be accountable, or they should be themselves members of this resource pool. Fifthly is graduated sanctions. So you cannot immediately kill someone if they, cut too many trees down or graze too many, too large a herd at once, or fish too much. Sometimes people make mistakes, or there may be certain reasons for the overfishing. Perhaps there is a drought, or there is some kind of a hunger, and so on. So she says here, appropriators who violate operational rules are likely to be assessed graduated sanctions, depending on the seriousness and context of the offense, by other appropriators, by officials accountable to those appropriators, or both. So she's basically discussing the whole time that too extreme sanctions can lead to, counter, or the contrary result, that people become even more oppositional to the existing rules. So there has to be some flexibility in implementing sanctions, and sometimes it can be enough to just warn someone, or symbolic gestures. Of course, if there are repeated offenses, she says, then one needs to be more serious about them and increase the effect of the sanctions. But you should not, again, start with the death penalty. That's very counterintuitive, she says. 6 is the conflict resolution mechanisms, where she says appropriators and their officials have rapid access to low-cost local arenas to resolve conflicts among appropriators or between appropriators and officials. So we'll see maybe in the example of the huertas in southern Spain, some interesting institutions for dealing with conflict, and some of the other examples as well. And again, this idea of not having to include some external actors to deal with conflict, dealing with conflict internal to the organization. Minimal recognition is number 7 of the rights to organize. The rights of appropriators to devise their own institutions are not challenged by external governmental authorities. And Ostrom in her book basically recounts many examples, a few examples of CPRs that fail in many cases because of the heavy hand of the state, basically intervening and creating some basically unnecessary complexity or unnecessary conflicts, and resolving oftentimes the conflict in favor of maybe even friends of the government, or friends, or there's certain elements of corruption. And so she says actually there should be as little involvement of external institutions like the government as possible, a soft touch approach. Of course, that can't always be avoided, and sometimes you have to involve external authorities, but again, it's a minimal level. So, and then she has a last condition, which is not universal. It depends on the size of the CPR. She says that, for those that are part of a larger system, these can be groundwater basins, for instance, is one example, which serve, a number of communities and not just one. Should be organized in the form of nested enterprise. So appropriation, provision, monitoring, enforcement, conflict resolution, and governance activities are organized in multiple layers of nested enterprise. And you can just imagine this as being an extension of the model. So you have a local authority here that deals with problems locally, and you have maybe another one dealing with problems in the next municipality. And to deal with the problems in both municipalities, you may have a higher order sort of enterprise or institution that is then able to deal with the conflicts between these two municipalities.
Just a quick
Yes?
question. The number 7 refers to the right to form labor unions, or what does it refer to?
No. I mean, it could, but it's more general. This doesn't refer to any particular type of organization. This refers to a common pool resource is just again, it can be a grazing ground for cattle. It can be it could be a type of an enterprise or company. It could also be a fishery. These are resources that where it is difficult to exclude others, basically, and that have a common um, uh, yes, where there are appropriators that are taking, say, fish or lobsters, for instance, is one of the examples, and we'll get to the case studies immediately afterwards. And but in a sense, they are defined by the difficulty in excluding others. So think about a field where cattle graze, the commons, um, and it's very difficult to say keep someone from using the field. And the notion goes back to this tragedy of the commons that, well, actually, if you don't have private property rights, the idea is that automatically people will overuse and the resource will be depleted, and then you can forget about it and move on somewhere else. And Ostrom basically builds up this entire theory or set of criteria where she points out that, in fact, based on really existing experience, there are many examples where people organize these resources without reference to any, government agency or private property relationships or whatever it happens to be. There's the ability to communally organize. And so the seventh point, minimal organization, the right to organize, basically means that the persons who are involved in this resource are able to organize themselves independent of direct, explicit state intervention. So the state doesn't come in and say, you need to do this and you need to do that, and otherwise you pay the taxes, or otherwise we will attribute the rights to this person and sell it to them. So what she's saying is that one of the ability for these resources to be successfully coordinated and organized depends on actually a minimal involvement of the state. This is not a right to organize, it's a right to organize free from the intervention of some local landowner or the municipal government or whatever it happens to be. Does that make sense? Yes?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So in terms of my lecture, that was actually